I'm very pleased to introduce our first speaker for this evening. He's Mr. Alok Goyal. He's partner at Helion Venture Advisors, and he focuses on enterprise technology investments. Alok also serves on the board of LinguaNext and is an independent director on the board of eClerx. Prior to Helion, Alok was the Chief Operating Officer of SAP India and has been associated with SAP since 2004 in various leadership roles in the US and in India. Before SAP, Alok has worked with Siebel, the McKenna Group, McKinsey & Company, and Cadence Design Systems. Alok has an MBA from INSEAD in France, an MS in Computer Science from University of Texas, and a BTech in Computer Science from IIT Delhi. Today, Alok will be sharing his thoughts on the changing landscape of enterprise IT. So may I request you all to please put your hands together to welcome Mr. Alok Goyal.
Giri, thank you so much for a very kind introduction and a very good evening to all of you as well. As I was walking into the door here, and I walked in just 15 minutes back, I actually did not know how large this place was going to be. So to be honest, I felt a bit intimidated. I didn't realize this is going to be such a large gathering. And then I was asking Pramat what the composition of this audience is. And I was told that these are the set of people that defines the future IT leadership in this country. So if I was not already intimidated, I think I feel even a little bit more so now after knowing as to what this audience is going to be. And therefore, covering the topic of today is going to be like preaching to the choir, because in many ways, you guys see this happen much before people like us do. But if I may, give a quick introduction in terms of what I do and the firm I work for, because I think that will set the background for what I'm going to talk about. So Helion is a firm that was founded 8 years back. We invest in early stage technology companies. So we invest in companies that are creators of technology, or companies that are also powered by technology, but are providing other kinds of services or e-commerce, etc. Personally, I focus on investments in enterprise technology. Been with Helion now for the last 2 years. As Giri mentioned in my background, most of my backgrounds actually have been in very large enterprises, actually working with the likes of you, going and knocking on the door, selling software on behalf of SAP, Siebel. That's what I've done in the past. But suddenly in the last 2 years, my context has changed a lot too. Now I'm talking to people who are two-people companies sitting somewhere in Pune or sitting somewhere in Bangalore, thinking they have the next big idea that they want to scale globally, and living, therefore, in a very, very different world. So what I'm going to talk about, therefore, will be a mixture of, I guess, what I learned during my days at SAP, Siebel, etc., and what I'm learning over the last couple of years as I'm working with a bunch of startups. Let me begin with the summary itself first, and I'm actually going to dive deeper. So what is changing in the enterprise IT landscape? And I'll just read this out first because I'm going to go deeper into each one of these. Number one is the fact that while change always happens, and we have been seeing how changes happened over the last many decades, but at least I strongly believe that the changes we are seeing the last decade from an enterprise IT perspective, that much disruption has just never happened before. And it's happening because of on a number of dimensions, which I'm going to walk through. It is also not the fact that we are done with this change. If you look at the pace of innovation that is driving the changes in enterprise IT, I don't think we know sort of where this dust storm is going to stop or come to settle. It's anybody's guess at the moment. I'm sure that being part of information technology function, you guys hear a lot about the changing role of IT, etc. There is a lot of talk about who is the real buyer of technology today. I actually do not think that the relevance of information technology or CIOs has changed or diminished. But I think what has changed is that a lot of the thunder that technology can drive within enterprises, that part is being stolen by someone else. And again, we'll walk through some of those examples. Specifically from an India perspective, I think probably until just maybe 5 years back, we did not see real technology creation happen out of India. We saw a lot of IT services out of India, but we did not see technology creation out of India. And I think in the last 5 years, that has changed dramatically. And again, we'll walk through some examples. And if I may, I would argue that a similar change, while it has happened on the technology creation side, but from a consumption side in the enterprise, India is still, I think, taking very baby steps. We have not seen the changes that one would ideally like to see in India. So with that as a backdrop, let me dive into some of the content. So if you look at, let's go back 40 years. You know, we had the mainframes that came in the 60s, 70s. At some point, the world moved to the minis, the client-server paradigm. Towards the mid-90s or the end 90s, we moved to a 3-tier architecture. And certainly with the emergence of the web, there were a host of new companies that got created, which includes the likes of Siebel, i2, Epiphany, and just many, many others. But by and large, we were seeing one major shift every decade. And that disruption itself was driving a lot of innovation. What at least we believe is very different at this point in time is that it's not a single axis of disruption. There are so many axes that in many ways, if I'm part of a large corporate, I don't even know where to begin to find as to where this confusion, if you will, is actually going to come to a rest. Some of these actually will be very obvious. You know, we often use the buzzword SMAC. Let's begin with the cloud. And I would argue that India hasn't been yet the strongest adopter of cloud yet. I used to work for Siebel until the end of 2003. And I remember that when I was in Siebel, there was a mail one day saying that maybe Siebel should explore a cloud solution. Because Salesforce.com had begun to just make some very early noises. It was maybe selling 2 licenses, 3 licenses, 4 licenses. And I remember a conference where Tom Siebel stood up and actually joked about Salesforce.com, arguing that, you know, this thing is never going to go up. They are not going to go to the large financial services companies in New York or the large tech companies in the Bay Area and be selling hundreds of thousands of licenses. I think time has proven us all wrong. Today, cloud has completely changed the way enterprises are thinking about consumption or even creation of software. But that's the obvious one. Again, the next one is equally obvious, mobility. I think there I don't need to preach to this audience. The next one, which is social. Again, if you think about social was the domains of the Facebook, WhatsApp, etc. But let me give a very different example. I was talking about a month back to the country manager of WeChat. How many people here know WeChat? Okay, many people know WeChat. Actually, you should know because, you know, while we all talk about WhatsApp, WhatsApp has about 70 million users in India. WeChat already has about 50 million users in India. It's a Chinese messaging app. They already have 50 million users in India. Now, we typically think of these just as consumer apps. So this guy was telling me that if you look at WeChat, while WeChat is a consumer app, WeChat is as much a business app. So it is now a web unto itself. So like you, every company now has a Facebook page. There are 5 million businesses in China that are actually present inside WeChat. You can do a search, you can go to their microsite within WeChat, you can ask for support, you can look for features, you can actually buy stuff, you can do payments. Everything can happen within a WeChat environment. So social media, again, I'm just giving a random example, but social media is being used to of course, create a brand, to generate leads, to be able to do customer support, think about what your future product direction should be. There are just a whole host of things today that social media is being used for. Some more obvious stuff, big data. Again, I don't need to tell this audience about big data. But the speed at which data crunching capability is changing. I remember I'm also a computer science grad, and in the early 90s, when I attempted a PhD, which I never completed though, artificial intelligence was a big thing. but it was not as big a thing as it is today. People used to talk about it, but it wasn't in fashion because a lot of the things that algorithms were being created at that point, the computing power just didn't exist to be able to bring those algorithms to life, at least the way we can do today. Just with the advent of computing power, Hadoop instances, just God knows what else is coming around in that stack, it has become possible to crunch data at a speed that was just absolutely not possible. And when that happens, you are able to reconceptualize very many different processes that you could not think of earlier. Like somebody was telling me that Unilever was, that this is an example a colleague of mine used to give, that he was in Berlin, and that day happened to be 39 degrees Celsius in Berlin. Now, we may think it's not a big deal, but 39 degrees Celsius in Berlin is actually a very big deal. And the guy was saying that if I had a way, and this is Unilever CIO, by the way, if I had a way, even 2 days back, which I know that I could predict that 2 days later, Berlin temperature might be 39 degrees Celsius, if I could redirect my supply chain in a way that all the ice cream, at least in the neighboring countries, could be diverted towards Berlin and adjacent areas, I could double my profit in the year just with that. The reality, though, is that the amount of flexibility, the computational capability that you need to be able to do that kind of stuff actually just did not exist. But let's look at some of the other ones which I think are equally interesting. Consumerization of IT. Again, it's a buzzword that we have all heard. Very often, consumerization of IT is confused with the fact that people have a very high expectation of user experience, which is true. I think everybody knows that the advent of Apple, to a certain extent, Google, Facebook, etc., has changed our expectations, also within an enterprise context. Where I think consumerization of IT is more relevant for this audience, though, is the fact that earlier information technology was actually bought either by an enterprise or by a department, and that department may not necessarily be IT department. It could even be marketing department or sales department. But where things are changing is the fact that an individual user within a business can now swipe his or her card and actually buy a product. So take an example. How many people here have heard of Slack, which is a collaboration tool? Any show of hands? Slack, very few. Slack, by the way, is one of the hottest startups that is out there in California today. If you look at Slack, which is being used by teams to collaborate within themselves, there is no CIO, there is no manager, there is no VP of sales, there is no chief marketing officer that's going to decide who's going to use what for collaboration. If I'm a team lead, I've got 5 people in my team, I just go swipe my credit card, and I pay $5 a month per user, and that's it. And that's where the consumerization of IT is happening, which is that IT users themselves are making the decision that they need to make in terms of what they need to use. And that is completely changing the way the proliferation of cloud applications are happening within an enterprise. Sorry, I'm actually walking through this linearly. No other slide is going to take this much time, but you see this curious picture on the right with a light bulb on the top. That's crowdsourcing. And again, to give an example, I met a company called Aperio. This is a New York, California-based company. Very interesting services company. So while IT services have existed for a long time, what these guys do is that if they get a project from a client could be any one of you, they actually conceptualize the project, they design, they break it up into chunks, and they put it out on the web to 75,000 developers, and they bid on these small components of that project. And therefore, they crowdsource. They don't have a staff, and so they're not worrying about their utilization factor, et cetera, et cetera. They just put it out on the web. They have a network, as I said, of 75,000 developers. These developers bid against each other for the price and how much they are going to do for that price. And multiple people often just create, these guys pick and choose which one they think is the best. Their job is to disaggregate and then to aggregate. But that's an example of crowdsourcing. You are leveraging the broader power of networking or internet, whatever you may want to call it, to be able to solve problems which otherwise were being solved through in-house staff. Another example, I met the pricing director of Walmart last year for Walmart.com. And he was talking about how they think about pricing. So it is not as if they have a box of Pringle chips, somebody sitting inside of Walmart.com is going to say, I think, given the competition, given the demand, I think this pack of chips should now be $1.40. What they do is they create 7 different pricing, they launch it out, maybe 100,000 people each will access that different pricing. They see how the reaction and the offtake is for these, whichever one, wherever the offtake is the highest, they actually set the pricing. So they're actually crowdsourcing against the intelligence from a pricing perspective, as opposed to somebody saying that I know what that price ought to be and therefore put that price up. Software defined everything. Again, this is something that, again, you guys will be very familiar with. We all began with either sort of storage on demand, computing on demand. We're also seeing now a lot of flavors of networking on demand. Literally, it's the whole data center on demand. Today, I've met companies who, if you go and tell that I want this environment with so much computing power, this kind of a storage, this kind of networking capability, literally you can go and configure and off you go. Those kind of things are available. Companies like Nutanix and several others have been there in this space, which are just radically changing the way infrastructure is being provisioned to enterprises. And the last one being the Internet of Things. Again, lot talked about, at least in the consumer domain, because somebody is wearing a smartwatch, somebody is wearing an exercise band, somebody is putting something inside their shoe, which is being measured. All kinds of Internet of Things is happening on the consumer side. But there is an equal amount of application that's going to happen on the enterprise side. I think we are seeing a lot of things happen in the manufacturing domain where people are collecting data from the shop floor and are able to do kinds of correlations that one would have never imagined. I met someone who said that depending on which day, what grade of coal I was using, I can now correlate my productivity vis-a-vis the grade of coal I was using, and therefore, whenever I'm putting my next batch into manufacturing, that's the kind of grade of coal that I need to use. So bottom line, all kinds of things are being done. Now, as you notice, there is not one axis, but many axes along which disruption is happening. And what happens when there is a lot of disruption? Startups just love that environment. If there is chaos, startups just grow and thrive in that chaos. And therefore, it is no surprise that the world is being bombarded today with startups. Actually, I think that today's time is extremely challenging and difficult, therefore, for a CIO, because you don't know where to place your bets. You know, earlier I used to go and sell SAP, and I would be talking to clients and saying that, look, once you install, you're going to run this for 15 years. How do you know what's going to be there in 15 years today? God knows. We have actually no clue what's going to be there even 3 years' time sometimes. Forget 15 years. And when that kind of chaos is happening, we're seeing a bunch of startups. I'm not going to walk through this list, but there's a first generation of startups that came purely because we said the world is moving towards the cloud. Salesforce was one, SuccessFactors being another in the HR side. But now there is a whole class of startups coming in the second generation which are leveraging different things. I'll take one example, maybe Lattice Engines in analytics. Very interesting company. If you are a company which has a very high volume lead environment, so marketing leads are coming. So you put a bunch of people who are then trying to qualify this lead so that salespeople get qualified leads. Now people are using big data capabilities. If you are a company which is getting 100,000 leads a month, over the last 2-3 years, you probably have 3 to 4 million leads. Now, when you have 3 to 4 million leads, you also have data as to which of these leads converted into actual sales. You can do a lot of pattern matching from that data and figure out and use that pattern matching to be able to qualify which lead has a higher chance of closure, which can close faster, which can close for a higher amount, and that's the kind of stuff that Lattice Engines does. One last example I'll take, user centricity is another angle. So I used to sell business objects, and again, I'm not going to downplay business objects here. But if anybody here has created dashboards in business objects or Cognos or any of these tools that have existed, we will sell it jointly to IT and to business stakeholders. Somebody will come in. For 3 months, people will be talking to the CEO, the COO. everybody downstream, what is it that they need to see on a daily basis, weekly basis, monthly basis. Some dashboards will be designed, prototypes will be created, Excel files and whatever will go back and forth. 3 months will pass by. The reality is many times that decision you needed to take based on that data, that context itself may be over. So met this company called ChartQ, completely trying to democratize the way business intelligence is being used. Literally, you take a spreadsheet, put it into ChartQ, it just pops up. And I would encourage many of you to just, if you have iPads, it's only an iPad tool right now, just go try it out. I mean, you will be just amazed by what kind of user experience and user centricity this kind of a tool has. And therefore, we are seeing all kinds of innovation come on a bunch of these dimensions. Is that innovation over? The point I was making earlier? I think far from it, far from it. I think we're only scratching the tip of the iceberg here. Bunch of figures here which are basically trying to suggest one thing. The amount of money that is being pumped in to drive these startups is actually just growing every year. And we are just taking one example, which is SaaS startups, and not all of enterprise is necessarily SaaS only. But you look at it year over year, from 2012 to 13, and this data is actually not complete for 2014, obviously. But there is every reason to believe that year over year, we are seeing at least a 25 to 40% increase in the amount of money being pumped into these startups, which is also an indication of the number of startups that are coming into play. On the right side, which is also very interesting, is the M&A transactions. Who is doing these M&A transactions? It's a large companies doing the M&A transactions. If I am Oracle, if I am SAP, if I am IBM, if I am HP and a bunch of these companies, they are also equally confused. Imagine trying to drive a product roadmap today in this kind of an environment. Nobody has a clue. And therefore, anything that seems to bubble up, people are buying today. At least my past employer, SAP, I remember that in the last 6 years, they bought Business Objects, then they bought Sybase, then they bought SuccessFactors, then they bought this e-commerce company I'm forgetting with, sorry? Hybris, thank you so much. Hybris, then they just bought Concur. The list just goes on and on. And it's literally like you are making one multi-billion dollar acquisition every year, because it's just so hard to keep up with these bunch of guys who are so much more nimble. Now, all these numbers, all these examples that I presented are clearly very Western market focused. We are talking about all these companies coming up in Silicon Valley, which is great. Is there anything happening in India as well? I think for a very long time, we saw India as a great place to create services companies, but we just never saw real tech innovation come in. We never saw real product companies being created out of India. I don't know if anybody read the Mint either from today or yesterday. There is this huge single page or 2-page article on Zoho. How many people here have heard of Zoho? Okay, many people have heard of Zoho. That's great. Now, Zoho has been around, as the article says, for 18 years. 10 years back is when they released their CRM. Nobody would have given them any chances of success. CRM had been there for ages. Siebel actually was on its way down by 2004, post the downturn, but Salesforce was actually growing at a very, very fast pace at that point in time. But look at what Zoho has done. Sitting out of India, following a completely remote sales model, they have done a phenomenal job. I think Zoho opened the wave, and then we have seen a bunch of companies come up. There is a database called Traction that tracks startups coming out of India. Last we checked, there were about 450 SaaS startups just out of India itself. And that shows the pace at which innovation is moving in India itself. And my apologies, I actually skipped a slide as I was going through it, but important for me to sort of roll back and make a point that I still wanted to, which is that as all this innovation is happening, I think the folks who will feel the most pressure, unfortunately, is probably this audience again. And that is because the way IT decision making is happening, that is getting democratized to a large extent. And this is some statistics that was borrowed from the corporate executive board, which argued that it's not as if IT budgets have gone away. Businesses have made decisions in the past as well, and even now, the technology spend decision that the business folks are making, that's 40% of the IT spend. And therefore, IT spend is actually still massive, it's huge. What has changed, however, is that decisions which are innovation-centric from a technology perspective, as opposed to maintenance-centric, 75% of those are being driven by the business folks. And again, I don't have an answer in terms of, or even a prognosis in terms of what does this mean for information technology. But I think it is certainly something to take note of, because technology is becoming so mainstream that people more and more are going to make these decisions themselves. There was a time when Salesforce, Marketo, et cetera, were going to VP of sales, VP of marketing, but that was still an organizational buy. As I was saying, today many users are making just decisions on their own. They're swiping their credit cards and making a decision. And even the departments actually don't have a control where a lot of the IT spend for the enterprise is going. And I think this is something for all of you to think about. Apologies, I'm coming back on the India piece. I mentioned that 450 SaaS startups itself, and that is, by the way, not the complete landscape of enterprise startups. As you actually dive deeper into these numbers, you'll realize that a lot of that has happened actually in the last 2 years, not even the last 5 years. The number of companies that have mushroomed, particularly Bangalore, Pune, Chennai, and to an extent NCR, Mumbai, is just growing like wildfire. And something has just completely changed in the Indian landscape when it comes to thinking product, thinking innovation. And I think that just, in my mind, at least shows a very bright future for the country. I'm going to give you some examples. These are biased examples because I know many of them, and I will confess in advance that some of these happen to be our portfolio companies as well. But the reason I'm giving these examples is because I'm closest to them, and I think I can talk through them. But it'll give you a flavor of what kind of enterprise-centric innovation is happening out of India as well. So I'll cover, let's say, Seclor. Anybody here has heard of Seclor? Because that's actually among the larger ones. So Seclor, I think, has about 400 customers in India, so in that respect, it's actually now a bit larger. But they do document security. So if you are sending a document to anybody over email, and you then want to control whether that person can open, forward, print, modify, save, all those kinds of security parameters if you want to control, then Seclor is a technology. Now, you could argue that Seclor could have come out of Russia, it could have come out of California, it could have come out of anywhere else. But these are founders who came from IT Mumbai and IT Kharagpur. Fantastic team. And again, doing this innovation out of India, which, as I said, I think, in my opinion, is a very good sign. Linguanist is an example of an industry which is $35 to $40 billion large. It's the language translation services. Massive industry, but completely services oriented. They are bringing a product-based approach to language management of enterprise applications. Most of the large OEMs spend hundreds of millions of dollars in trying to maintain their software across many different languages. Customers themselves, as they create custom reports and many other things, have to spend those dollars as well. They are again bringing a product-based approach. I'll cut to the chase and come to the end, which is example ZapStitch. I put this here not because they are portfolio, but because I met them. This is one of the latest companies I met, and I just love them so much. It's a company that allows you to do cloud-to-cloud integration. Now, cloud-to-cloud integration has also existed for a while. There are companies like SnapLogic, MuleSoft, and a few others, which allow you to integrate a Salesforce to a HubSpot, et cetera, et cetera. But these guys are bringing it to an art form, in my mind, and bringing it down the chain. So if you happen to be a shopkeeper with 5 crores revenue, you're using QuickBooks, and you are using a Shopify for e-commerce, how do you make sure that an order which is generated in Shopify automatically shows up as an invoice in QuickBooks? And how much time does it take to install and run this application? It takes exactly 5 minutes. In 5 minutes, you're actually up and running with the integration itself. That's how much time it takes. And I was amazed to see that at least In my limited knowledge, I would have assumed that such kind of companies are only the property of the West, but that's certainly not true any longer. And I think it's very encouraging to see many of these companies getting created out of India. And I'm going to come to my last slide, which is actually based out of research that we did jointly with 9.9 earlier this year. We went out to somewhere between 50 to 100 startups, and we went to an equal number of enterprises in India. And we were asking them about their thinking and decision making. And on the IT side, we were asking how many of you truly engage with startups. Now again, you don't have to engage with startups. It was a proxy for the ability to take risks with bleeding edge stuff. Because at least when I meet startups, I can tell you that I normally see 4 or 5 names. I will not name those names. But literally those 4 or 5 companies as customers show up in every presentation. And it is sad to see that those are the only 4 or 5 companies which are willing to take a risk with something that is truly cutting edge or bleeding edge. If you take the flip side of it, while there's a lot of innovation happening out of India, most of this innovation is actually now not targeted towards India. Why? Because startups at an early stage need early adopters. They need people who can take a leap of faith. They need people who can work with you to actually define the product roadmap. But I think that category of early adopters is just completely missing in India by and large. And therefore, and this data is actually also a little bit old, there was even a more recent research, that which geography are these startups from India selling to? 75% are targeting US as a primary geography for a go-to-market. And that is not because India is a very small market. Depending on which numbers you believe, India is already a $30 to $50 billion IT market. There is no dearth of number of end company as targets. But I think where certainly there's a dearth of is companies which can be innovation-centric are willing to take the chances, willing to take the risk, but also reap the benefits for some of this innovation. And I think that part, in my opinion, still needs to be changed. And I'm hoping that this audience is the one that is going to lead that change. So with that, thank you so much for being patient and listening to me. Thank you.
Thank you, Alok, for a very wonderful talk. I think we all enjoyed seeing some of those startling bits of information that you put up, and it's given us a lot of food for thought. So thank you so much for being here and for sharing all these insights and all this knowledge.